Welcome, welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Maassarani. Visiting professor at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University, and your moderator for this month's Zehr Institute webinar on restorative justice and the design of intentional physical space. I would like to begin by acknowledging the histories, tragedies, ancestors, and stories that are tied to the physical spaces in which we find ourselves in. Myself, I'm currently coming to you from the Mojave Desert, land of the Paiute, and home to bighorn sheep, red sandstone, and the mighty Colorado River. We spend about 85% of our lives in built structures, in a built environment. And so this is going to be the topic we explore as it connects to restorative justice today. But we'd like to begin by reading from you your thoughts on what physical space means to you. So you will see a prompt posted to the screen asking you for the key thing you need in a space if you are preparing to have a difficult conversation. Please respond to that prompt using the comments feature. Now, while we wait for your responses, I'm going to go over the agenda for the day. We're going to begin by a brief introduction of our guest speakers. Each will have about 5 to 8 minutes to present to you, followed by a conversation between them. Then there will be time for questions and answers from the audience, followed by some announcements related to the Zehr Institute and the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. We hope you're able to stay through the whole thing until the end, but if you can't, there will be a recording of this webinar posted to the Zehr Institute website and YouTube channel by early next week. If you'd like to watch it again or share it with others, you're most welcome. A brief disclaimer that we do not have a secure platform, so in case of disruption, do not attempt to exit. Instead, close your laptop or turn off your device immediately. If this happens, we'll resume the webinar again after 10 minutes. So now I'd like to introduce very quickly our speakers for today. So our first speaker, and this is not actually in the speaking order, but is Deanna Van Buren, who's co-founder and executive director of the Design Justice plus Design Spaces. And you can find these bios on the Zehr Institute website if you want to read them fully through. So we're excited to have Deanna. Barb Toews will be joining us as well, Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at University of Washington, Tacoma. We'll have Cynthia Hammond. This is, I'm sorry, I didn't fail to mention Dr. Cynthia Hammond, as well as Dr. Toews and Dr. Van Buren, is an artist and professor of art history at Concordia University. We have Greg Labrosse, who is a PhD candidate in humanities at Concordia University as well. And Dr. Ipek Türeli, an associate professor and research chair at the McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. So without further ado, we're going to go to our guests here, starting first with Cynthia, and then moving on to Greg. Cynthia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Tarek, and patience, if you can hear me, this would be the time for my slides to come on screen, if that's possible. While we're waiting for that to happen, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded Indigenous lands of the Ganyenga Haga Nation, and that Jojaga or Montreal has long been a gathering place for many First Nations. It's such a pleasure to be participating in this webinar today. I'm very honored to be in the same virtual space as Deanna and Barb, who you'll hear from later. And I would like to, just looking at the interface here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the work of Dr. Luis Sotelo Castro, who is my colleague and collaborator at Concordia University. Luis, who I believe is in the audience today, is a professor in the Department of Theater at Concordia and has been doing amazing work in oral history performance and what he calls acts of listening. Listening, of course, being central to the work of both restorative and transitional justice. So Lewis has been leading major interdisciplinary dialogues on listening in post-conflict societies, especially through what I think of as very groundbreaking interdisciplinary work, community-engaged work at his research lab called the Acts of Listening Lab, which is located in Concordia University's Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling. So a few years ago, Lewis was giving a talk on precisely this work, listening in the context of a post-conflict society. And he explained that very few formal restorative and transitional justice processes take place in purpose-designed spaces. And this was very mobilizing for me. I had not known anything about this before, but through my research, I discovered, for example, that during the collection of truth and reconciliation testimonials in Canada, these had mostly been gathered in kind of borrowed spaces like church basements and schools that were empty during the summer. But exactly this kind of space would have very profoundly negative associations for many Indigenous individuals. And I'm showing you an image on the screen taken from a residential school in Canada. So even just stepping into such a space like this for the purposes of giving one's testimony about what one had lived through as an Indigenous person could be, in fact, re-traumatizing. And so it became clear to me that space was incredibly important to alternative justice practices, to the extent that it could even be detrimental to an otherwise well-intentioned process. So I began to learn about the astonishing work, of architects like Deanna Van Buren, and to feel strongly that such work is at the cutting edge of socially engaged design practice. And all this led me to apply for federal funding in 2019, Canadian funding, to learn more about the spaces in which restorative and transitional justice take place. So in addition to Lewis, you see here our research team comprised of Dr. Ipek Türeli, who you'll hear from later, Marcela Torres Molano, who unfortunately can't be here today, Greg, who you'll hear from later, and Vanessa Sikat, who also unfortunately cannot be here today, but amazing research team. And what we have been working to produce over the last 2 years is this website. It is live, and it's actually part of a larger website that is organized by Luis Sotelo Castro called the Letitia Listening Acts. And I'm putting links in the private chat. I don't seem actually, Tarek, to be able to put links in the comments, but maybe you could copy them and share them with the guests. So I'm giving a link to both the website that you see pictured on the screen and the larger website around listening and conflict that this is part of. So our central research question for the project was, how does space affect the processes and experience of restorative and transitional justice? And what we wanted to do was to create an open access research tool that would share our results with a wide community of practitioners and students as well, of course. And I don't have time to go into it in detail, but I will mention that the drawing that you're seeing on the screen right now, which is the work of our research assistant, Marcela Torres Molano, is in many ways a kind of summary of our findings in terms of what makes a successful restorative justice space. But maybe we'll talk about that more in the chat during the discussion. So a central aspect of restorative justice and transitional justice is truth-telling, witnessing, and listening. So a central part of our methodology was oral history and interviewing. And really over the last 2 years, the team has conducted interviews with 35 individuals who are involved with restorative justice and/or transitional justice, and sometimes those categories overlap. And our interviewees so far have been alternative justice architects, caseworkers, advocates from Canada, Colombia, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Those are the main countries, although we do have interviews with people in other countries as well. And here I'll just show you, sorry, Here we go. This is just a screenshot showing you a few of our interviews from American practitioners, and you're going to recognize maybe a familiar face in the top right-hand corner. Tarek gave us an amazing interview last year. And I'm delighted to say that Barb Toews is also going to be interviewed for this project. So there are a variety of perspectives that you can encounter through this section of the website, the interviews section. And we really hope that this variety will help the visitor to understand that the spaces of restorative and transitional justice are shaped by participants as well as by architects and designers. However, it's very important to us to show how architecture and design, even in very modest projects like zero budget projects, have a significant impact on how alternative justice takes place, how it is lived or experienced by the participant. So to this end, we also have information on 35 case studies of purpose-built and adaptively reused spaces in which restorative justice and or transitional justice activities take place. And again, the case studies to date are primarily but not exclusively from Canada, Colombia, United States, Australia, and New Zealand. I did want to show you briefly what a case study might look like on the website, but unfortunately we weren't able to do sort of true screen sharing. So you'll have to trust me that there's extensive data for each of these websites. So not only what is it, where is it, but how is it being used, who designed it, what exactly is the nature of the alternative justice work that is taking place, and sort of what values or principles or politics are built into the design of the space, what challenges are being faced by the alternative justice practitioners in that space, and so forth. In the interest of time, though, I will just give you one case study that we do explore on the website, and this is the Rangatahi Court. This is an adapted youth court process in Aotearoa or New Zealand, which uses existing architecture. So this adapted youth court process is specifically for Māori or Indigenous youth, for first-time offenders under the age of 17. And this is a group that is like at every age, in fact, in New Zealand, but disproportionately represented in the court system and in the prison system. So several things distinguish this adapted process from the ordinary courts. First, the Rangatahi Court takes place on traditional tribal lands of different Māori nations. Second, the court takes place within the traditional ceremonial building of that nation, or the wharenui, which is understood to be a site where the individual connects with both the land, so this sort of sacred land surrounding the wharenui, and with the ancestors who are represented within that space in different ways. So the young person who is facing this court is quite literally surrounded by their heritage and culture. And because each wharenui is decorated with intricate symbolic carvings out of local materials, it's a very grounded and site-specific and community-specific process. Finally, the court is presided over not only by settler judges and officials, but also by elders within the Māori nation in question. So this presence of elders is extremely significant. It's a non-hierarchical seating arrangement. And more importantly, the elders are part of every decision, including sentencing and follow-up. And most importantly, these elders make the link between the young person and, as I think this slide shows so beautifully, the invisible community of ancestors that the building houses and protects, and in fact represents for someone who can understand the visual and spatial language. So I think this example helps us to understand how the built environment, so deeply implicated in systems of power, in cultural and community traditions, and in personal experience, is really central to the idea of justice in this context. So the last part of the website, which you could visit, but you would be frustrated, is our designs section. And you can see that this part of our website is under construction. And this is a part of our process that I'm very excited about because it ties directly to some pedagogical activities that we've also incorporated into the project. So over the last semester, myself and Dr. Ipek Türeli have both been teaching courses using the material on this website in our respective institutions. So I've been teaching an architectural history course, and Ipek has been teaching a design studio. And our intention was that the projects that result from this kind of interaction between our two courses would also be featured on the site. So in fact, we only had our final critiques yesterday, but here you can see, this is just one example, architecture students Georgia Wallman and Brandon Nikumana presenting their project Sound and Space in a Land of 1,000 Hills. This is a community center project, a proposal for a community center project situated in Natenyo, Rwanda, which aims to be part of the transitional justice and peace building processes in this nation. So it's a project that addresses memorialization, education, and economic development issues in Rwanda, and thus speaks to the different roles that architecture can play in the healing of communities in a post-conflict society. And this was meant to be a video, but I can't show you the video. But it's a very beautiful project that incorporates an extensive garden and a garden that is specifically designed for listening to the experiences and memories and even the silences left in the aftermath of trauma. So with that, I'm going to thank you and hand things over, I believe, to Greg.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, Cynthia. Patience, if you can also, here we go. Those are my slides. So I'm going to sort of continue the conversation with two examples from Colombia. These examples are taken from the website that Cynthia just talked about. And the reason why I'm focusing on Colombia as a country, it's where I've been based for the last 20 years. And I think the two case studies that I'll be showing you are good examples of some of these things that Cynthia is talking about. Namely, what interests me is looking at the built environment and architecture, not only as a place for cultural practices to happen, like as a location, but also architecture as a reflection of certain cultural values and certain social hierarchies that exist in society. So I'll go right into it. The first case study is a museum. It's an itinerant museum of memory and identity in the Montes de Maria region of Colombia. So this is on the coast of Colombia. Colombia is situated very close to the Caribbean Sea and also the Pacific on this side. Bogota, the capital, is near the center of the country, but now I'm referring to this coastal area in the north of the country, which was the site of several massacres during the Civil War. A peace agreement was signed in 2016, and many initiatives have come forth since then, proposing spaces for restorative and transitional justice. The two examples that I'll be mentioning today are examples of restorative justice practices, although they fit into this broader framework of transitional justice after the signing of the peace accord in 2016. So this first case study is the Itinerant Museum of Memory from the Montes de Maria. This is the founder of the museum, Soraya Bayuelo. And here I'm showing you this image to talk about Soraya, but also she was the winner of the Peace Award in 2003 in Colombia, and also a National Journalism Award in 2007. She's from the region and has been working in these processes since 1994. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about later on in the discussion is the process in terms of time duration of these examples. And the mochuelo, that name is a bird from that region. This is the bird, and it was chosen as a symbol for the construction of the itinerant museum. This is the blueprint of the museum. It's small, but at the same time, it contains many different modules for people from the region and visitors to the region to sort of explore the memory and identity of the people and the cultures there. And so I'm going to show you a little bit some images here of the dimensions and the modules, the specific modules of the space. It's 18 meters long, 12 meters wide, 5 meters in height. You can disassemble it and reassemble it depending on the location where they want to present the information within the museum. It travels mostly in the small towns of that region, in the coastal area of Colombia. And it weighs 35 tons, so it's quite a task to disassemble it and reassemble it. The first module is the welcome hall, which sort of gives some general information about the museum and about the region of Montes de Maria, which is a rural area of Colombia, it's worth noting. The second module is information about the territory and the memory in terms of the history of the conflict and the victims of the conflict, which is something we'll talk about during the discussion period. And then you have at the center of the structure, the tree of life, 700 leaves, paper leaves, with the names of the victims of the armed conflict. And modules 3 and 4, they call them the wings of identity, which focuses on cultural practices, not from the past, but from the present, and the meaning that those cultural practices have for the communities of that region. And module 5, as you're exiting the structure, as you're leaving through the back, there's a patio theater, as they call it. And it's just an area where people could stop and reflect and talk about what they've seen, or just talk about anything that they would like to talk about. There's an area where there's traditional games from the region, because this space is open to both adults and children. And sometimes the children, they explore the spaces, but then they go to the back and start playing some traditional games of that region. I thought that was an interesting addition to the design. So the design process was led mostly by the Centro Ático of the Javeriana University in Bogota. You can see Soraya here to the right of the screen. And it was funded by several different agencies, institutions, governmental institutions from Colombia, but also from abroad. Spain was involved, so was Norway and France. And basically the focus of this space is the victims of the conflict. And in 2011, this is before the signing of the peace agreement, state institutions and civil society were meant to work together to achieve justice and the non-repetition of the violence. And so El Mochuelo is a good example of a citizen-led initiative. So it comes from the civil society. This was an idea from a citizen, in this case, Soraya. And it's more a bottoms-up initiative as opposed to a top-down initiative, which is the second example that I'm going to talk about. And that too is an interesting point of conversation that we could discuss a little bit later. And so since it has been inaugurated, it has received more than 20,000 visitors to date. So I'm going to right away talk about the second example so that we could use them as, as a comparison. This example is La Casita in Bogota, so the capital. Bogota is a city of more than 10 million inhabitants, a very urban context, in contrast to the rural context of the first case study. And La Casita is house in Spanish. It's this yellow house here in the center of Bogota. This is the interior space. And it's a relatively small house, but they've installed some curtains to create sort of divisions within a larger space. And within those smaller spaces that are created by these curtains, certain pedagogical activities are taking place. And so this was designed by a design studio, an architectural design studio. And they focus mostly on recognition, of self-recognition as a cultural recognition, reparation and reintegration into society, and this is to achieve restorative justice. They work with young offenders in Bogota, not necessarily from Bogota. Sometimes they're young offenders who have come to Bogota from different regions of Colombia. And it's basically the purpose of the activities that take place within this space is the reintegration of the young offenders into society. And so they designed three sort of boxes, if you will, to that serve as a tool to undergo these pedagogical activities. The first one here, which has the symbol of a triangle, is the one for self-recognition, and it's where the young offenders could share stories, share narratives of their experiences. The second one, which has the symbol of this circle, it's to listen. It's to listen to different experiences and to different histories of conflict and histories of people who have survived the conflict and perpetrators of violence as well. And then the last one, which has the symbol of a square, is for projecting, not only projecting these narratives that have been shared, but also projecting proposals for the future, ideas about the future of these young offenders. So this is part of the reintegration into society for restorative justice. And so the questions that come to mind, at least for me, and I would like to propose here for the sake of discussion, on what principles and values are these examples of justice architecture based? So as I said at the beginning, it's not just a location for cultural practices to take place. These two locations are also a reflection of cultural values. I'm going to go back to this one in Montes de Maria. And you can talk about different values that are reflected here. I think first and foremost, it's respect for the victims, and this both at the civil society level, but also at the state level, this has been part of the discourse of the last few years in Colombia, a respect for the victims and to achieve justice, not only justice, but also to achieve a non-repetition. So a peaceful coexistence between different actors in society. But there's also the question of the value of access. So who has access to these spaces? And you could sort of compare these two examples, the one here in the Montes de Maria region, who has access to these spaces, and also who has access in terms of participating in the design process of these spaces. And here I do see some differences. I think they're both pedagogical oriented in their approach, but you can see some differences in terms of how people use these spaces and how much access they have in terms of the information presented and the design process itself. Another point that they have in common is this using shared cultural memory as a starting point for building a better society. And I know that the Zehr Institute focuses a lot on this idea of restorative justice. Is when you ask yourself, what are we restoring when we talk about restorative justice? One of the things that the Zehr Institute talks about quite frequently is this idea of restoring trust between the different actors in society. So both of these use culture as a starting point and a shared cultural memory as a starting point for building or rebuilding trust in society. And so I think this is an interesting part of the conversation as well. One of the things as a researcher that I'm very much interested in, and I'll end on this point, is how these cultural practices and these examples of architecture are embedded within a certain, cultural framework, if you will. And this embeddedness is important to think about when we design these spaces, and think about who is using these spaces, but also, how are they participating in the design process as well? Because we often talk about bottoms-up initiatives versus top-down initiatives. And I think that beyond that conversation, which is an important conversation to have, how do these structures enable social practices to flourish? And so even if it's bottoms down, sometimes it does enable those types of practices to happen, this flourishing, this building of trust to happen, and when they're bottom up as well. So I think that when we talk about the built environment and these spaces of restorative justice, how do they enable these social practices to flourish, and not exist as spaces sort of isolated from the embeddedness of cultural practices? Like this is where we want this to happen. In contrast to, we have to build these spaces in many different areas of a city or of a rural community so that there's an embeddedness to these practices. Thank you very much, and I hope you will find this useful in our discussion to come.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you to Zehr Institute and Dr. Tarek Maassarani for the invitation. I'm really honored to take part in this discussion. I'd like to start by land acknowledgement, a very short one. I am connecting from Yale University, which is built on unceded land. We're on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, one of the 5 founding nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I'm going to first offer a description of spatial justice. My chair is in architectures of spatial justice, and Dr. Maassarani has asked me to explain how it's related to restorative justice. So I'm going to first offer a description of spatial justice as a concept. Then I will offer an overview, very short overview of my different research projects that fall under the umbrella of my chair, which I hope will concretize a little bit how the concept relates to architecture and the built environment. And finally, I will discuss the relationship between spatial justice, social justice, and restorative justice, which I hope will initiate some debate. So the concept of spatial justice is usually traced to the writings of Henri Lefebvre on the right to the city, which dates from 1968. And neo-Marxist urban geographers since Lefebvre, such as David Harvey, Don Mitchell, and Ed Soja, have connected in their writings social justice and the space, and they refer to the space of the city, not specifically necessarily the built environment as we understand at this scale, conventionally as we think as architects. So it was Ed Soja who coined the term in his book Seeking Spatial Justice, which was published in 2012, but urban geographers have been making this connection between social justice and the city for a long time, since the 60s at least. So while none of these theorists writes on architecture as a discipline, the centrality of space and spatial relations in their theorizations make them relevant for the study of the built environment. So the first objective of my scholarly investigations is to contribute to the broader goals of understanding how fundamental issues in democracy are embedded in space in the design of our cities, streets, public spaces, housing, and schools. The accessibility of the built environment, and not only the built environment, but the design discipline, is vital to building democratic societies as articulated in past years' social movements. And by accessibility, I'm not referring to physical accessibility, of course, though as it may, it is very, physical accessibility is very, very important, but I'm really referring to social political accessibility as well. So the second objective of my research program is to support and promote new work by emerging scholars to shift the focus of architecture research explicitly toward social justice topics. And in my research projects, I investigate these broad questions in 3 research areas. First, spaces of education, housing, and third, spatial activism. and I'm an architectural historian, so I bring past efforts for social justice and architecture into dialogue with current efforts, so the latter can build on them. And in addition to leading specific projects under these three main areas, I'm also collaborating with colleagues on projects that fall under the broad umbrella of my chair. And it's one of these projects is Transitional Justice. And this has been, as Professor Cynthia Hammond has explained, a collaboration initiated by her. And 3 or 4 years ago now. And it was the case study of Montes de Maria Itinerant Museum of Memory and Identity that Greg Labrosse has just presented that captured my attention as the right scale model for an undergraduate studio. It's a bottom-up community-driven project. So as Professor Hammond has explained, we just finished an undergraduate design studio. May I share an image of snapshots so you don't have to see me and can pick them? Let me see slides. Okay. Maybe I will manage that as I am. Okay. Okay. So as I was saying, we just completed teaching a design studio on transitional justice based on this research collaboration. The research materials presented on the project websites such as case studies, interviews with transitional justice practitioners, people who have gone through transitional justice processes, and architects became a resource for the studio to draw from. Dr. Hammond, our collaborator, Dr. Luis Sotelo Castro, they have given guest talks and participated in reviews along with research assistants Greg Labrosse and Marcela Torres Milano. Research is one way to push for change, and I'm thrilled to be able to bring my collaborative research into the classroom, into teaching. But I also do a lot of outside of classroom teaching. And what do I mean by that? I do a lot of programming on spatial activism where students are involved. These have included exhibitions, panels, workshops, guest lectures, ranging from race and architecture to climate justice and the built environment. And I'm able to do these thanks to the resources of the research group on democracy, space, and technology, which I coordinate under the Jan Lin Center. I firmly believe we need to start any change from education. Architecture as a profession has a whiteness problem, and by whiteness, of course, I'm not referring to skin color. I'm referring to a system of privilege and authority. And as Deanna Van Buren points out, I've listened to her lectures online. Architects are trained to serve the 1%, and my professed goal as an educator is to counter this culture head on. So my focus on spatial justice as educator has meant not only addressing what we teach, but the content, but also how we teach it. And this studio has been a great achievement in that respect. The students have been very active, and it's been a collaborative process with them as well. And I suppose some of them are in the audience, so I congratulate all of them for participating by choice. It was an option studio in this process of collective learning. So I want to move to the third final part of my presentation. So spatial justice and how it's related to restorative and transitional justice. Spatial justice itself can be considered a subset of social justice, which is about the equitable distribution of resources and opportunities in a society. It's very different at first glance from restorative or transitional justice, but there is an important link which not discovered, but which this research project brought to light. So restorative justice is about how different voices, victim, offender, and witnesses can be called upon to find a way forward in a situation where an offense has been created. And the question is, can restorative justice contribute to social justice, and how, and what are the limits of restorative justice to contribute to spatial justice? So this is a question I'd like to discuss collectively. In architecture, many of my colleagues will readily claim that architecture or design cannot contribute to social justice, because social justice, in their view, requires restructuring the economy, redressing other people subject to discrimination and intergenerational disposition. It's too big for architecture, they will claim. And then there are those who will go into impoverished communities, not at McGill since the 80s, with the rise of phenomenology in architectural history and theory, perhaps, but still prevalent in places like rural Alabama, where white instructors and students will go into African American communities and build homes for them in a model of charity. So beyond those two models of we can't do anything towards social justice and we'll go and help the impoverished others, there must be other ways we can explore. And I can imagine restorative justice practitioners saying similar things, like restorative justice is about reforming the criminal justice system, social justice requires restructuring the economy, and how can restorative justice practices at the level of individuals relate to that? And I'm sure those discussions are happening. However, it seems reducing the impact of imprisonment, which leads to unequal burdens of employment, debt with interest burdens, and so forth. Avoiding the criminal justice system can contribute to advancing social justice. So in the studio, thinking about spaces of restorative and transitional justice has meant thinking through the social context of crimes and understanding how social justice or injustice is historically created by criminal acts ranging from colonialism to denying humanity to certain groups. So it has really expanded our understanding of social and spatial justice. So I'll end at that. Thank you.
Thank you to Cynthia, Greg, and Ipek. It was great hearing about your work, and that website looks amazing. Deanna and I are going to be the last presentation here, and we are going to be focusing on spaces for survivors, particularly thinking about survivors of violence. And in doing this, we are going to be talking about the methodology that we used to include criminal justice and restorative justice practitioners, as well as violence survivors and those who've committed violence in designing spaces, report on some of the findings that we found, and also look at some of the renderings that Deanna and her team at Designing Justice, Designing Spaces are creating based on those findings, and then also real world spaces which are exemplifying these particular kinds of design elements. So you're going to, in the course of this research, we kind of where we're going to focus is on research and design of a prosecutor's office, a restorative justice space, and then a collection of other kinds of spaces. And you will just see on the bottom there, this link actually takes you to a toolkit, which is related to something that we're going to be presenting here. So if you're looking for a practical toolkit to think about how to apply some of what you're hearing today in your own settings, this is one example of a place to go. And you can also go to Designing Spaces, Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, where you see the website here for more information as well. And just a little bit about myself, as I said earlier, I am out here at University of Washington, Tacoma, where I teach in a criminal justice program. And my research area is on the relationship between restorative justice and now increasingly trauma and the design of justice spaces, of interior design and architecture, and how that relates to psychosocial, behavioral, and judicial outcomes. And also just want to note that I am here in Tacoma. I'm on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Bayonne tribe. And UMT would not exist as an institution without being on this land. And so we recognize the history, problematic and violent history that is part of that. Deanna, do you want to say a little bit more about yourself before we dig in?
Yeah, I'm an architect, and I started a firm designing spaces to end mass incarceration, beginning with restorative justice spaces. So it's been an incredible journey, and working with Barb for 10 years. And I got kicked out of my presentation, so I'm trying to get it back.
Well, why don't I get started anyway while you're bringing that back? So as I mentioned, we want to tell you about some research and design projects. And we wanted to start by telling you a little bit about the methodology that we use to find out from people what kind of designs they want in their spaces based on how they want to be feeling in those spaces, and what are the design characteristics that are going to lead them to have those feelings. And so the work of designing justice, designing spaces pre-COVID was very much in person with design workshops. The projects that we're talking about today have been done since COVID, and so we have actually moved into the virtual realm and are using virtual methodologies where we have an electronic survey which goes out for people to complete. And one of the things that makes this very unique is that it's a very visual-based survey. And so if you think about the prompt that you got at the beginning of the session, we use that same prompt or a version of it in the survey. And then people are asked about 20 design questions, which include visuals for the response, so that they're not just taking, a boring old survey that, gets kind of tedious and boring in the middle of it. We're finding that people are very engaged when they take it. And even when we had students in particular test it, they said it was fun and healing to even just take the survey, and that it got them thinking about ways that they can use space better than what they already do. We also, when we're doing the virtual gatherings, we are in a Zoom space, and we use a collaborative electronic whiteboard in which we have people react to the design of spaces. So for instance, with the prosecutor's office, we posted images of key spaces in the office where survivors would find themselves and have them comment on them. What do they like about the design? What kind of feelings do they elicit? And then we move into directly using the collaborative whiteboard for design work, in which there are basic room layouts, usually with the actual dimensions of the spaces that we're looking to redesign, and then using images and some architectural kind of, things that represent walls, things that represent windows. People actually decide how they want those particular spaces to look by moving images into the space. Deanna, are you still trying to get the slides up?
They should be up. You don't see them?
Yep, now I do. I didn't before. So you'll see on the right an image of the survey. To your left on the bottom are people using Post-it notes within the collaborative whiteboard to add comments to the pictures. And then at the top, you see how participants are moving images into design plans to design them. So go ahead. Then in terms of analysis, we're using all of this as part of our data. We're also recording all of these sessions, so we have the actual transcripts and the verbatim quotes that we can be using. So what we do on the left there, you can see that we have design criteria that we're looking for, and we will code all of the designs that they create in the whiteboard for all of its different design elements. And we go in with some predetermined, but then also pay attention to some new design elements that emerge as the groups are different. We take everything that we heard about the feelings and Post-it notes that they put their comments on, which is up there on the top right, and analyze those. And then also the bottom, for one of the studies that I've done, which we'll look at briefly later, used a set of design cards where people actually picked images in response to questions before actually talking with words about questions. And so then those pictures are also analyzed alongside the transcripts for what they mean. So as far as what we're learning through these different processes, is that we are coming up with a framework for the types of design elements that people want in spaces that are restorative justice oriented or trauma informed, where survivors are going, and have been working on really outlining what these are. Here you see 6 key and broad focal points that came out of the study with the prosecutor's office, and now in a study that we're doing with the Restorative Justice Program, finding that these exact same broad categories come up. Not surprising, they're pretty broad, but that we're having a lot of overlap also with the details. Next slide. What we're also finding is that when we match their designs with what they're saying in the actual transcript while they're talking, we're able to make some pretty clear links between the design elements that they're talking about, feelings that they want to have within the space, and then also how that connects to their experience with the justice system. With the Essex study, where you see one of our summary points right here, we're able to connect their design elements to these 5 feelings that you see here, and then to elements of procedural justice, which was one of the foci of this particular study. And so we could see how different design elements, if you feel safe, you're going to have this kind of experience with the justice process. So that means we should be designing spaces in which survivors are interacting with justice professionals with those design elements that they say help them feel safe, and so on. What we're finding, next slide. What we're finding as we're finishing up our analysis with the Restorative Justice Program, that we are also able to link desired design elements with trauma and trauma-informed care, and what we know about what survivors need in order to transform and trauma energy. So we are finalizing that. So we can see that here are 8 things that we've used to create our framework for this. We can see the types of spaces then that participants wanted that can take us back to those trauma-informed care principles that we're using, and then what the design of those very spaces should look like in order to do the same thing. So we've been taking these findings and really starting to organize them around kind of established theories for justice that are meant to better serve victims.
Okay, can you all hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I'm going to show how we've been spatializing some of these. So you're looking at the waiting room in the lobby of the Essex County Prosecutor's Office. And this space, along with a lot of other spaces, we're eliciting feelings from folks coming here of anxiety. They felt unsafe. They were distrustful of the process. They felt insignificant. You can see it as none of the findings embedded in it, right? It's too small. It's cramped. The finishes are hard. Institutional lighting is terrible, broken, uneven. There's no art. There's no color. There's no nature. There's no windows. And the spaces pretty much look like this. And folks are waiting in here for hours to talk about the death of a loved one. Sometimes suspects are in here. You can have 15 people in this space. So we are not surprised to find that this is the feelings that it was eliciting. And so what we heard is what people want to feel is they want to feel calm. They want to feel safe. They want to feel cared for. They want to feel confident in the system and respected. So we've been taking sort of approach about really making this more of a living room, right? A domestic space. We opened it up. We started to create niches and nooks that elicited prospect and refuge, right? So I feel contained, but I can see. We added elements of nature. We added in fake windows. We put in lighting that was soft and controllable through dimmers, representations of nature in art so that we can reduce people's heart rate when they come in, objects of comfort like coffee and tea, puzzles to play with, games, soft seating, cushions, pillows, and redid all of the finishes. And this is really also coming from the data, right? This is what we're hearing people were asking for. And I think one of the challenges with restorative justice spaces is that we need to provide visibility. People need to be able to see, but they also need privacy. So looking at a lot of translucent surfaces, moving walls, things that we can begin to support those sort of sometimes diametrically opposed needs. And at Common Justice, right, this is their main space that folks come into. We saw a lot of same things. They want to feel calm. They wanted to feel safe. They also wanted to feel uplifted. And being in New York City, they also wanted nature to come to the forefront, right? So representations of nature became much stronger in this design response. You'll also see the sort of the clustered seating, creating a diversity of seating. There's a water feature, very clear pathways to the kitchen so people can serve themselves, but also this idea of sort of boundaried and designated space and clear wayfinding. Right? That's something we hear a lot of, in particular at Common Justice, because we have responsible parties and harmed parties coming to the space. They do not want to cross paths. So responsible parties, which spend more time here, have a collection of rooms, a lounge where they can go and meet one-on-one with staff. Harmed parties on the opposite side of the space. They have their own pathway to a lounge where they can rest and bring loved ones with them to support them also. And then at the center, we have the convening, right? So this is where the peacemaking room is, the conference room, staff is at the back. There's clear circulation around what is a core to the place so that we can have two doors, right? Responsible parties and harmed parties can come in two different ways. This was spent a lot of time trying to get this right. And so those passageways are critical, right? We have to think about those components. So this is Essex County again, and you can see this is the hallway that everybody has to go in to get to the waiting room, which is on the right, which you saw, to get to the desks where the prosecutors and detectives are working. And you can see what the situation is, right? The spaces are cramped. It's terrifying to have doors that are solid, right? Nobody knows what's going to happen behind that door. The signage is very triggering in terms of just having plaques, awards on the wall. That sign for the homicide squad sign is sometimes the only way a survivor coming here knows that they lost a loved one. Sometimes they don't even know till they see that. We are going through environments that are highly triggering, bland, same kind of look and feel. So what we did was start to think about these transitions that need to be safe. We put a door on the waiting room. We opened up the doorways. You can see with like a translucent layer, clear signage, opening up the whole space using art, right? So it feels bigger, it looks bigger. We've also started to remove some of the desks to create sort of a buffer space as you move through. So these are some of the strategies that are coming out of the work that are really, really essential so that people know what's happening. They can stay calm, they can feel safe and respected. We did the same at Common Justice, right? We moved walls around. We opened up the front so the whole space is flooded with daylight, natural light. Acoustics were very important to folks. They called it ear hustling, right? So we're always trying to navigate the visible privacy, need for transparency, but also the acoustic privacy that folks need. So once you get through the passage, right, you're now in the space where you're really meeting with harmed and responsible parties. You might be meeting with the prosecutor. These rooms are often multi-use, right? So you might be having a circle process in here, but you might also be having another kind of meeting. And so that was what was happening here in this conference room. The table is totally unable to be moved. You have those solid doors again. These spaces always need storage, so trash is piling up. Clutter and mess is also very anxiety producing. There was a whiteboard that would have totally inappropriate material on it, cases and things like that. So what we started to look at was like, how do we convene with care? We needed to create a sort of storage wall system so things could go into it, not the door system, but tucked into that is a kitchenette. so that people can serve themselves. We created sliding whiteboards so you could hide and move things and use them. We clustered the seating again, foldable, movable things that can move to the side, right? So those are sort of simple furniture solutions, finishes solutions, lighting solution, all of these coming together to create a much more trauma-informed space for survivors. Common Justice, very similar. They had some very clear needs for acoustic privacy. So starting to ramp that up through sort of acoustic wall panels, translucent windows so people can see but not see, right? So these are the kinds of strategies, both at the micro scale and the macro scale in terms of layout, that is essential. And our toolkit that'll be coming out, Barb put one in the link, it has all of these. What are the accessories you need? What's the furniture you need? All of those, so that it's very practical, right? So that people can really use this and implement it in their own context. So when we start to look at where these have been built, right? So we have the research, we have sort of this sort of spatialization, we built some of these spaces, and some of them really came out of really robust community engaged processes, bringing together stakeholders. This is Restorative Justice City Oakland, where we looked at a distributed network of hubs throughout the city of restorative justice spaces, types of schools and community centers. Coming out of that process came a restorative justice center. This is a country's first restorative justice and restorative economic center. It's about an 18,000 square foot project, and it has a whole collection of things in it. Part of that process really involved engaging folks in its design. We always do that. With the restorative justice space, it was primarily intended for youth. So we did model making, we used Google Glasses, we did collage, we used the peace and justice cards, and we're able to really code and analyze that and get that into the spaces. So what's interesting about Restore is it's not just restorative justice, right? It has a restaurant that trains low-wage restaurant workers to get living wage jobs. It has community organizing space, all of them part of an ecosystem in this building. And the restorative justice space is dedicated to restorative justice. That is all that happens here. Young people are diverted out of court into this space. Community can do restorative justice here. They do trainings here. But you can see a lot of the elements that we've been learning about are implemented. The biophilia, right? The nature, representations of nature, cool off space. The color is really calming. Light is bouncing in and into the space. There's an expression wall that absolutely came from the youth, right? And it's been a hugely successful space for the organization and for the community. And then this project, the Near West Side Peacemaking Project, is in Syracuse, New York, and it is completed 5 years. We used a process to get people to understand restorative justice. You know, what kind of spaces do we need for peacemaking? And we're able to take an old drug house and actually turn it into a peacemaking center where Native American peacemaking practices were coming into a non-Native community for the first time. And the success of this project has been tremendous, right? Building social cohesion, folks are using it as a community gathering space in addition to restorative justice. So I'll pass it to you, Barb. I don't know if we have much time, so I want to make sure we're respectful of that.
I'll make it quick. So want to give a shout out to Candace House, which is located in Winnipeg, Manitoba in Canada. And they were committed to providing a space for survivors to go to when they were attending court procedures. So if you imagine, you're in court for the homicide of your loved one, and you're taking a break in court, and where do you go? Well, a lot of courtrooms have what are called safe and secure waiting areas. They often can just be some throwaway chairs they got from the basement and a dirty coffee machine. And that's where you sit. And Candace House wanted to do something much better. So, or a group of people in Winnipeg wanted to do better and created Candace House. Before it actually was a place with a site, I worked with their executive director to get design feedback from allied professionals in the community as well as survivors, and used those cards that you saw earlier to get them thinking about what would the design of Candace House look like. The most chosen picture out of this deck of 100 cards was this image that you're seeing right here. This is what they wanted for a space to relax, to rest, to rejuvenate in the course of a trial of some kind. They worked with an architect to create a space that met what we heard. There were a total of, I think it was 8 characteristics fully. Deanna, if you go to the next page. They created a space that looks like this. So if you imagine a dull and gross courthouse waiting area specific for victims, they've obviously created something very different. They were very clear in that they wanted it to look like a house, actually. Very intentional in creating a living room area, a dining room area. And before we move to the next slide, if you look at the square, the black square at the top of the ceiling, that is the ventilation system for smudging. So they were very intentional in bringing that in, since a lot of the people that are coming through their program are First Nations people. Deanna, if you flip to the next one. They also, in this space, created little nooks there on the bottom left. That's just a seating nook off the kitchen. On the bottom right, you see the kitchen area fully stocked. They provide meals. There's coffee and breakfast there in the morning, so people can stop there before going to court, go to court, they come back and lunch is made for them. If they're there in the evening, they have dinner, all that sort of stuff. On the top left, this is their entrance into this space. The space is technically called Healing Haven. One of the things that is really important is they have the area there where you can take your shoes off and take your coat off, and the basket that you can just see there in the corner is actually a basket of slippers. What becomes really interesting about this is a no shoe zone, which is pretty Canadian. When prosecutors, detectives, any other criminal justice professionals come there, they also take their shoes off. And so what has been interesting in that dynamic is that it's kind of equalized people, that everybody, not even criminal justice professionals, are wearing their shoes. So there's some things going on there. And then on the top right, that's a private soundproof room for when they want to have a really private conversation with someone who's there, a criminal justice professional, or quite frankly, if they need a nap. So what they're finding here is that it is providing a really, let's say, therapeutic space for survivors when they are away from the courthouse, where they can truly relax, feel nourished, feel supported, and actually then more readily engage with the trial proceedings of what's going on, and actually to better handle some of the things that they're hearing that are really difficult. They're actually now in the process of almost doubling their space and expanding what the services are that they offer.
So thank you all.
All right, I would like to thank all of our guests today for very stimulating presentations here. Looking at our time, let's take just a few minutes to have a conversation amongst the guests, and then we'll open up to questions. I note that there have been a couple questions already in the comment box, and we'll get to those. So I'd like to start off, and maybe I'll start with a question, but I really encourage all of the speakers, if you want to engage with each other, if you have things you want to bounce off of and echo off of, etc. I'd like to know if any of you found that there was something in the presentation of another person that particularly stood out for either aligning or being in tension with what you're doing in your work.
One of the things that really caught my eye with Cynthia was the slide of the opening page of your website, and the icons there that were pointing into the space. And I was like, ooh, I want to know what all those icons are that you have there, and like have conversation where there's overlap with what we're coming up with those parts, and where the new learnings are from the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you, Barb. And I had the exact same thought because, but I think the huge a defining difference between your research and ours is that whereas we're working with existing spaces, you are really going straight to the people who are using these spaces and for whom these spaces are most important. And so we are going to learn a lot from you, and I'm very excited about that. But it is true that I was as close as I could get to my screen reading the findings that you've both come up with so far through these interviews and these very creative forms of really sharing the authority around who gets to decide what such spaces should be. And some key things that stood out between, our schematic design drawn by Marcella and your findings, definitely the need for privacy, for window views, for the space can confer confidence in the user that what they share will be held in confidence. Yet at the same time, there must be a sense spatially of the transparency of the whole. Natural light, acoustics, these are all things that have come up. It's a very haptic, embodied, sensory, and emotional experience for people to go through these alternative justice processes. There is one question, a burning question that I do have for Barb and Deanna. One of my most favorite things about the West Side Peacemaking Project is the garden. And, we've talked a lot, and you shared in your presentation how important biophilia and having plants in these spaces, or even the representation of plants, is important. But in another sort of vein of my life, I'm very interested in gardens as part of, as having healing potential, which is something we've heard about for a long time. But in the context of alternative justice, it seems especially important. So, and I know, Barb, in your work, gardens are very evocative for the kinds of women inmates that you've interviewed, for example. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about gardens and how this is coming up, or if it is.
Yeah, I can say a little bit first and then Deanna. Yeah, so one of my colleagues is a landscape architect, and she has really been, and then another colleague is an occupational therapist who specializes in healing gardens. And both of them have really been turning towards very specifically what's the role of nature and the natural landscape in trauma-informed care, or for populations who have experienced trauma. And part of that has been looking at women who are incarcerated and designing gardens within the context of the prison, and looking at what are the impacts of that, and finding that it really has powerful impacts on one's emotional state, on one's kind of, believe it or not, ability to collaborate with other women who are incarcerated. They're improving their relationship because of how having one of the gardens was a visiting room garden, and how having a garden to go out to and a nice patio to go out to, how that really helped the mothers, and grandmothers and aunties build relationships with their families and children that came to visit them, and develop memories, that you don't have when you're just running around a visiting room, if you're allowed to run around in a visiting room. So yeah, definitely a big piece of the puzzle.
Any other questions or comments you have for each other?
I had a question for Greg about, because I've been to La Casita, such a fantastic project in Colombia. And has there been any evaluation done on those spaces? Do we know? I heard a lot of anecdotal stuff when I was there, but I'm just really curious about both the impact of the moving museum piece, but also La Casita, if you know.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Deanna. So I actually interviewed Carlos Medellin, who was part of the design team, and I asked him about that. So these young offenders who participate in this program, how, what's the follow-up like in terms of, do they know if this reintegration process has been successful or not? And if so, how do they know? And he sort of described a separation between the design of the space, the practices, the pedagogical practices in terms of, the communicative strategies that they're using, and then the psychosocial, that's the term that he uses, the accompaniment from the counselors, from the government, basically, the counselors are the people who are responsible to do this follow-up. So apparently it's done at the beginning of the program, towards the end of the program, and then a year later. But it's difficult, in my opinion, of what I was able to sense, to gauge how successful that sort of accompaniment process is. And I think it's part of the process. And one of the things, just to remark a little bit on the way you presented your findings with the 6 dimensions of spatial dimensions, one of the things that came up really frequently in the conversations that we've had with these practitioners, it's not only the spatial component, and this goes back to the original question that Tarek poses, what is needed for these difficult conversations to take place? It's also the rules of engagement. And so as you were describing your research, that came to mind for me. And one of the things that I think is necessary is this preparation previous to the actual encounters, which is like super, super important. And this was expressed by many of the survivors of violence, and the rules of engagement as well. And in the design of the spaces, I find that the human touch, like basically one of the findings, if I'm sort of paraphrasing here, but what people who use these spaces want to feel is that their well-being is important. And one of the things that also I thought about as you were describing your work is how a human presence is also important. So that, and I'm thinking of La Casita here, where if the person feels uncomfortable, even if the space per se is really well designed, if they have nobody to say, who can help me, that's for me, that's a little bit, makes it even more difficult.
Yeah, I think, we're always coding for design operations, which is what I would call what you just said from the architecture. Like, how is this being operated? Do you have an ambassador? Is there a greeter? Do you have a dog, right? Somebody wants even if a dog comes, it's something. And then also the challenge that we've been having around how do we evaluate the space as a part of the success and separate from the program, right? So there's the program, there's the operations, there's the space. So it's just been a challenge that I think we're trying to tackle.
Because my experience has been more Colombian spaces, which are very makeshift in a way. Like they don't have the same financial resources in most cases, at least the ones that are citizen-led. But what there is this human presence that if you do need, like the first thing they do is welcome you with a little cup of coffee. So there's a real human presence, which I find is really, really important in this conversation.
We code it as hospitality. That's the hospitality piece. It's critical. It's critical. Yeah.
And can I just affirm that too, in light of Candace House, they think of themselves as kind of 3 things: service, staff, and space. And it was clear in the interviews with families that used the setting that it was really hard for them to separate them out, because hospitality is a spatial thing because you need the kitchen, but it's a service thing. But it's also the fact that the Candace House staff know how to present it and how to welcome you into that space at 8 o'clock in the morning and welcome you back for lunch and bake you fresh cookies that smell amazing when you're coming back from court. So it is that mix of all 3 of those. Yeah, I agree.
The cultural ritual as well, I think, is really important in this.
Yep, absolutely. These are spaces for cultural ritual. That's what's happening in Syracuse for sure. For sure.
Thank you very much, everyone. I just wanted to see, Ipek, if you wanted to add anything before we go to the questions from the audience.
In the interest of time, I'd love to hear from the audience.
All right. So we had a few questions already. I'm going to name them all 3, the ones that I've been tracking, just so we have them and we can try to away our time in answering them. One is, what is transitional justice? Kind of a background question. Another one was to Greg, and it had to do with to what extent are parties in a conflict/war involved in the designing of their restorative or transitional justice spaces? In other words, do you have parties mutually choose an acceptable location where those spaces to be held, and mutually maybe even design or decide how. And then the last question that I've tracked here is really the question of how to implement the teachings and practices, especially coming from indigenous traditions around these concepts that pull together, space, people, and so forth. How do you implement those into our daily life? So those are the three questions. I'll just open it up. If there are more questions, please feel free to type those into the chat, into the comments, though our time is scarce. Any responses to any of those three questions? Cynthia.
So maybe I could tackle the first one, and to apologize for not defining transitional justice, which I should have done. So obviously, yes, as another commentator pointed out, restorative justice is founded in many different indigenous and traditional societies, and we think of it today as an alternative to the sort of Western settler colonial judicial system, but in fact it precedes that system by millennia. But it is a form of reconciliation between a harmed party and the party that has done the harming. Transitional justice attempts to learn from restorative justice's emphasis on the survivor and grows that to the level of the community or even the nation. So you see transitional justice processes taking place in nations where there have been gross atrocities committed against a specific group of people. So for example, in Canada, that would be against Indigenous, Inuit, and First Nations. Also, you see it in, for example, Rwanda, where there was a civil war, and Colombia is our other big example. So transitional justice is really modeled on restorative justice, the principle of truth-telling, the principle of each party getting to tell their story, but bigger, and it's often, not always, but often it is state-sanctioned and state-run. Okay, that would be my short answer.
With the second question, thinking particularly around design kind of issues, but probably with other things too. I think the important thing is to ask people what they need in the spaces. Thinking about Candace House again, when it came to making sure that Candace House was culturally respectful and relevant and created space for people to use the cultural practices that they use for justice and healing and those sorts of things. They knew some basics. We need to smudge, need space where people have control to do that. But there was also just this bigger picture of asking, I'm a white woman, I don't know. The ED of Candace House, First Nations herself. So just asking people and kind of recognizing the limits of our own knowledge.
So maybe just to clarify with regards to the question that was posed, and I'll be very brief in terms of the Colombian context, but basically the civil war in 2016, there was a peace process, a peace accord was signed. So a lot of these are legal mechanisms, and they sort of are embedded within the criminal justice system, but they've created these new mechanisms in Colombia, one in particular called the JEP, the JEP, which is a special justice for peace. So in terms of transitional justice, they want to change the conversation towards peaceful coexistence, towards non-repetition of these violent acts, and truth-telling. So a lot of these processes involve the collection of testimonials. And they have in every region of Colombia what they call truth houses, where people can go and render those testimonies. And I guess the big difference, to sort of answer the question, is that you have these institutional spaces, which sort of usually already exist, but sometimes are modified to allow for this testimonial collection. And then you have more citizen-led, more bottoms-up initiatives, spatial initiatives, where people could sort of, as I mentioned in my presentation, start from a shared cultural entry point to have these difficult conversations. And so in the case of the Itinerant Museum of Memory and Identity, that was really the objective of that space. It's a pedagogical space, but it's also sort of a spatial pretext to have these conversations about who we are, what has happened to us collectively, and where do we want to go.
Right, thank you. So the last question had to do with how do we make this, how do we bring this to our daily lives? And maybe I could add a twist to that, which is, you know, for all the practitioners in the audience who, like myself, hadn't thought about this, but then realize how absolutely crucial and in some ways obvious this is. What recommendations do you have for them to move forward in their own practice?
I can just elevate the tool. We keep making toolkits for this very reason. So we have a designingjustice.com as a toolkit that Barb and I created. You might want to put that in the chat, Barb. It's for working in high security settings, but the tools in there can be used in any context. There's a lot of them. We also have a Creating Restorative Spaces in Schools toolkit on our website, at designingjustice.org. You can see that. And then, of course, we have the Essex Spaces for Survivors toolkit, and we'll have more of that coming out this year. But those are things that we create to hopefully help people do that.
And maybe to that, I would add, because I've read all those toolkits and they're amazing. Even if you don't have any other resources resources other than the boardroom with the garbage piled up in the corner, and it's really hard to make the connection between what we're sharing with you today and what you have to work with. One thing that really came through very, very strongly in our interviews was the importance of giving the individual, especially if it's the harmed individual, choices. So where to sit, whether, what is the light on or off, that even those very simple things, they are actually spatial decisions. And even at that very fundamental level, they can give a sense of agency. So spatial agency, of course, but it's also, self-determination within a process that, ultimately was very self-negating. That's why they're there, right? So, and I was very touched looking at the renderings that Barb and Deanna showed us. On one of the images we saw, there was simply a blanket laid over the back of a couch, and that alone says so much about the intention, as Barb and Deanna put it, to ensure that the participant is unharmed in the process. You can't protect them completely. Obviously, it is a harming process to go through this reconciliation. But even something like a blanket or a pillow or a candle, many of our interviewees mentioned simply having a candle in the middle of the table that they chose to light or not.
And we had, to circle back to our opening question to the audience, we had a few responses already name things like seating in a circle, having clear exits, space, access to the outside windows. And I remember myself fairly recently, because of the pandemic, hosting probably my first restorative process totally outside in a sheltered park area next to a bubbling brook. And everyone commented on how relaxing that was. So, I noted there were a few values or qualities that were brought up in the responses people gave, including comfort, transparency, and then also the active listening as being important in a space where they're going to have a hard conversation. So in many ways, you've offered us a whole number of ideas that allow folks to increase the possibility for that, in addition to the possibility for vulnerability, for healing, for privacy, and so forth. I wanted to thank everyone. I think we've gone through those questions. This has been a wonderfully informative session with you all. My final thoughts would be, I had the privilege of having dinner with Joseph Kunkel, who you may recognize as part of the Mass design group. So Mass being model of architecture for serving society. They do similar work in some ways to what has been described here. And one of the things that Joseph was telling me about is their book, which is a collection of essays and photo essays, visual essays, called Justice is Beauty. And I was thinking about that as I heard you all speak, that in many ways, especially as I saw the photos, what you're doing is creating beautiful spaces. And then I started to think, well, maybe that's really the way we can describe overall what we're doing in this work, is somehow beauty becomes synonymous with things like transparency, vulnerability, safety, comfort. So that's sort of my closing thought on this. We have a few announcements that we're going to work through. So thank you again to our panelists. We have more webinars coming up. This was the last of the spring webinars. So we take a break over the summer, and then we have 4 starting in September. Check out the zehrinstitute.org/webinars page for the upcoming lineup. And of course, check it out also for recordings of all the past webinars, including this webinar, which we'll have up in a week or so. We have our STAR 1 and 2 courses, that's Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. Registration is up for both of those. They are now in person. Our Summer Peacebuilding Institutes, they start from mid-May through mid-June. And then again, we've got February and March courses. You can find registration and more information on the website at bottom. There's a Restorative Justice Graduate Certificate if you're interested in deepening your knowledge, your practice in restorative justice. Find more information at the website link on the bottom. There's particularly a Restorative Justice in Education focus area that EMU provides, the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, either a concentration as part of the MA in Education program or the Restorative Justice in Education Graduate Certificate. We have the Masters in Conflict Transformation in Restorative Justice and in Transformational Leadership at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. Very practitioner-based curriculum, and that's currently been running hybrid, so that we've had folks from all around the world. And you can visit our website, zehrinstitute.org, for more information, stay connected, and find out and follow up. I want to thank everyone for spending this time with us, and I hope you all have a beautiful day. I'd like to say your goodbyes, our guests. You can unmute yourself, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.